The rooster hasn't even crowed yet, but you're already awake. Your body aches from yesterday's labor, and you can feel the cold seeping through the thin walls of your humble cottage. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness holds the promise of another grueling day ahead. You are not a knight in shining armor. You are not a wealthy merchant or a learned monk. You are something far more common, yet infinitely more essential to the fabric of medieval England. You are a peasant, and today we're going to walk in your worn leather shoes, feel the weight of your daily struggles, and understand what life was truly like for the 90% of people who lived, worked, and died in the shadow of castles they would never enter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the steady rhythm of ancient knowledge guide you into peaceful rest. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us transport you back 700 years to a world where survival was never guaranteed, where hope was as precious as gold, and where your entire existence revolved around the rhythm of seasons and the mercy of those who owned the very ground beneath your feet. It's the year 1347, and you live in a small village called Ashwell, nestled in the rolling countryside of Hertfordshire. The Black Death hasn't reached England yet, but even in these relatively peaceful times, life is anything but easy. Your cottage is tiny, perhaps 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. The walls are made of wattle and daub, essentially sticks woven together and covered with a mixture of mud, dung, and straw. There are no glass windows, just wooden shutters that do little to keep out the cold. The floor is packed earth, covered with rushes that you change when they become too filthy to bear. You share this space with your wife, Margaret, your 3 children, though you've buried 2 others who didn't survive their first winters, and during the coldest months, even your pig and chickens sleep inside with you. The smell is something a modern person could never imagine, a mixture of smoke, unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the constant dampness that permeates everything. But this is home. This is all you've ever known. As consciousness slowly returns to you this morning, you can hear Margaret already moving about, stirring the embers of last night's fire. Fire is life in medieval England. It provides warmth, cooks your food, and offers the only light you have once the sun sets. Letting it die completely would be a minor catastrophe, as you lack the luxury of easily rekindling it. Your oldest son, Thomas, is 12 years old, practically a man by medieval standards. He's been working alongside you in the fields since he could walk steadily. Your daughter, Anne, is 10, and she helps her mother with the endless domestic tasks that keep a medieval household functioning. Your youngest, little William, is only 6, but even he has chores that would exhaust a modern child. The hierarchy of your world is absolute and unchanging. At the very top sits the king, chosen by God himself, so far above you that he might as well be a figure from legend. Below him are the great nobles, the earls and dukes who control vast territories. Then come the lesser nobles, the knights and lords who own the land you work. And then there's you, a villain, bound to the soil, as surely as the oak trees that dot the landscape. You cannot leave without your lord's permission. You cannot marry your children to whomever you choose without his consent. You owe him a portion of your harvest, days of labor, and ultimately, your complete obedience. But even within the peasant class, there are distinctions. You're actually somewhat fortunate to be a villain, rather than a serf. You have certain rights, small though they may be. You can own property of a sort. You can pass your holdings to your children. Some of your neighbors are worse off, owing even more to the Lord, or working as simple day laborers with no security at all. As you slowly rise from your bed of straw and rough woolen blankets, your joints protest. You're only 35 years old, but decades of back-breaking labor have aged you beyond your years. Most men in your village, who reach 40 are considered ancient. 50 is practically unheard of. This is breakfast. There's no ceremony, no variety, no abundance. The bread is made from whatever grain was available, often barley or oats, mixed with whatever else could be ground to make it go further. Sometimes, in the hardest times, even ground acorns or beans find their way into the flour. The ale is safer to drink than water, though it's so weak it would barely qualify as beer to modern tastes. Everyone drinks it, men, women, children, because the brewing process kills the harmful elements that make water dangerous. Even little William gets his daily portion of ale. As you eat this meager meal, you can hear the church bells beginning to ring across the valley. The sound carries far in the still morning air, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the hours of the day, announcing births and deaths and marriage. The church bells are the heartbeat of medieval life, a constant reminder that God is watching, judging, and that your suffering in this world is merely preparation for the next. Today is a work day on the Lord's domain, the portion of land reserved exclusively for your Lord's benefit. 3 days a week, you must leave your own small plots and work his fields instead. It's called corvée labor, and it's as much a part of your life as breathing. Your Lord, Sir Ed. You've seen Sir Edmund perhaps a dozen times in your entire life. He's a distant figure, usually on horseback, sometimes accompanied by other nobles, or his steward who actually manages the day-to-day affairs of the manor. To him you are less an individual than a component of the land itself, valuable certainly, but in the same way that soil or livestock is valuable. This morning you're joining 20 other men from the village to begin the harvest of the Lord's wheat. It's late September, and timing is everything. Wait too long, and autumn rains could ruin the crop. Move too early, and the grain won't be fully developed. Your very survival depends on reading the subtle signs of nature, the color of the grain, the feel of the stalks, the behavior of birds and insects. The tools you carry are simple but essential. Your scythe has a wooden handle, worn smooth by countless hands, and an iron blade that you've sharpened so many times it's becoming thin and fragile. Iron is precious. When this blade finally breaks, replacing it will cost you dearly. You also carry a sickle for more detailed work, and a wooden rake that you carved yourself during the long winter months. Thomas walks beside you, carrying his own smaller tools. At 12 he's old enough to work a full day, though the law says he shouldn't do the most dangerous task. Not that the law means much when survival is at stake. Every pair of hands matters during harvest time. The work begins before the sun has fully risen. Harvesting grain by hand is an intricate dance that requires skill, timing, and incredible endurance. You bend at the waist, grasp a bundle of wheat stalks in your left hand, and slice through them with the sickle in your right. The motion must be precise. Cut too high, and you waste valuable straw. Cut too low, and you dull your blade on stones and dirt. Bend, grasp, cut, move forward 6 inches. Bend, grasp, cut, move forward again, hour after hour, row after endless row. Your back screams in protest. Your hands blister and crack. Sweat stings your eyes despite the cool morning air. Behind you, Margaret and the other women follow with wooden rakes, gathering the cut grain into neat bundles. Anne helps tie these bundles with twisted straw, her small hands surprisingly efficient at the task. Even little William has a job. He walks behind everyone else, gleaning any fallen grains, collecting them in a small basket. Nothing can be wasted. The sun climbs higher and the work continues without pause. There's little conversation. Everyone needs their breath for labor. Occasionally someone might call out a warning about a hidden stone or a particularly thick patch of grain, but mostly there's just the whisper of blades through stalks, the rustle of gathered bundles, and the steady rhythm of 20 people working in unison. The rough grain stalks have cut small wounds in your palms and fingers, and the constant gripping of tools has reopened old calluses. This is normal. Harvest hands are always bloody hands. Margaret will make a poultice of herbs tonight to help them heal, but tomorrow they'll be torn open again. The sun beats down mercilessly now. Medieval England isn't known for blazing heat, but when you're bent over, working without rest, wearing the only clothes you own, a rough woolen tunic and braids that haven't been washed in weeks. Even a mild day becomes a trial of endurance. Around noon, the steward appears on his horse to observe the work. He's a thin, sharp-faced man named Geoffrey, and he serves as Sir Edmund's eyes and ears. Geoffrey can read and write, which makes him almost magical in your world. He keeps detailed records of everything: how much grain is harvested, which peasants work hardest, who might be trying to steal a bit of the crop for themselves. You and the others automatically work a bit faster when Geoffrey is watching, not out of enthusiasm, but out of fear. A reputation for laziness could mean extra duties, reduced food allowances, or worse. In a world where margins for survival are razor thin, you cannot afford to displease those who control your fate. Geoffrey carries a staff of office and wears clean clothes made of better fabric than you'll ever touch. His horse is well fed and groomed. His boots are leather, not the wooden clogs or wrapped cloth that protect your feet. These small differences represent a chasm of privilege that you can never hope to cross. After what feels like an eternity, the church bells ring the hour that signals the midday break. You straighten up slowly, your spine crackling like dry wood. Every muscle in your body protests as you walk to the edge of the field where Margaret has brought a simple meal: more dark bread, some cheese if you're fortunate, and watered ale. You eat sitting on the ground, too tired to speak much. Thomas massages his shoulders, already learning the constant ache that will define his adult life. Anne picks burrs and chaff from her hair and clothes. Little William has fallen asleep in the shade, exhausted by his morning of gleaning. The break lasts exactly as long as the steward allows, perhaps half an hour. Then it's back to the endless rows of grain, back to the repetitive motion that will continue until sunset. Your shadow grows longer as the day wears on, the only reliable measure of time passing in a world without clock. In the modern world, people speak of 8-hour workdays as if they were a natural law, but for you, work continues from sunrise to sunset, regardless of the season. In summer, that might mean 14 or 15 hours of labor. In winter, perhaps 10 or 11. The sun is your timekeeper, and it shows no mercy. Your scythe feels heavier with each passing hour. The wooden handle, worn smooth by decades of use, has become slippery with your sweat and blood. You've switched hands several times to prevent cramping, but both arms burn with fatigue now. The blade, despite your careful sharpening, has dulled from cutting thousands of stalks and needs frequent attention with your whetstone. Thomas works beside you, trying to match your pace despite his shorter stature. You feel a mixture of pride and sorrow watching him. Pride because he's strong and capable for his age. Sorrow because you know this back-breaking work will be his entire life, just as it was yours, just as it was your father's before you. There are no schools in your village, no books, no possibility of learning a trade that might elevate him above his station. The church teaches that everyone has their place in God's great design, and questioning that order is tantamount to questioning God himself. Thomas will be a peasant farmer, marry a peasant girl, raise peasant children, and die young from a lifetime of hard labor. This is not tragedy to your medieval mind. This is simply the way the world works. The other workers around you represent the entire adult population of your village. There's old William, actually only 42 but ancient by village standards, who moves more slowly than the rest, but whose experience in reading weather and crops makes him invaluable. His hands are gnarled like tree roots, his back permanently bent from decades of field work. There's young Peter, barely 16, but already married and expecting his first child. Marriage comes early in medieval England, partly for practical reasons. You need a partner to share the enormous workload of survival, and partly because life expectancy is so short that there's no time to waste on extended courtship. Margaret's sister, Joan, works nearby with her own children. She's a widow. Her husband died 3 years ago, when a cart loaded with grain overturned and crushed him. As a woman alone, she's centrally vulnerable. She owes the same labor obligations as any peasant, but she must also manage them with only her children to help. The village community provides some support, but resources are too scarce for extensive charity. Everyone knows everyone else's business. They have to. When someone falls ill during harvest time, others must take up the slack or the entire community suffers. When a house burns down, the whole village helps rebuild it, not from pure altruism, but because today's victim could be tomorrow's helper. Gossip travels fast in a community of perhaps 60 people. Who's been sneaking extra grain from the fields? Whose daughter has been seen talking too often with the miller's son? Which family might not survive the coming winter? These aren't idle conversations, but vital intelligence that affects everyone's survival strategy. As the afternoon wears on, your mind begins to wander, as it always does during the most repetitive tasks. You think about the upcoming winter and whether you've managed to set aside enough grain to feed your family through the lean months. You calculate and recalculate the sacks stored in your cottage loft, the portion you owe to the Lord, the amount needed for seed next spring. Too little grain stored means starvation by February. Too little seed saved means no crop next year, and certain death for everyone. There's no safety net, no government assistance, no borrowing from banks that don't exist. You live or die by your ability to judge precisely how much you need to survive another year. You also think about the church's teachings on suffering and redemption. Father Benedict preaches every Sunday about the nobility of honest labor, about how your hardships in this world earn you treasure in the next. The meek shall inherit the earth, he says, and the poor in spirit are blessed. These words provide some comfort during the hardest days, though privately you sometimes wonder why God's plan requires quite so much suffering for quite so many people. The church is the only institution that offers hope for something beyond this endless cycle of labor and survival. Its promises of eternal paradise for the faithful are your only glimpse of a life without hunger, without pain, without the constant fear of crop failure and starvation. You cling to these promises because without them, the brutal reality of your existence would be unbearable. But faith doesn't make the scythe lighter or the hours shorter. Your shoulders burn, your lower back has locked into a permanent ache, and your hands have cramped into claws around the handle of your tool. The sun seems frozen in the sky, as if God himself has decided that this particular day should last forever. Around mid-afternoon, disaster strikes. Young Peter, pushing himself too hard in the heat, stumbles and falls directly onto his own scythe. The blade slices deep into his left leg, just below the knee. Blood immediately begins soaking through his rough woolen hose. Work stops instantly. This is every harvest worker's nightmare, a serious injury during the crucial days when every hour of labor matters. Peter lies on the ground, his face white with shock and pain, while his blood darkens the earth beneath him. Margaret and the other women immediately take charge of the medical situation. There are no doctors in your village. The nearest physician lives in the market town 15 miles away and charges fees that might as well be the king's ransom. Medical care is a matter of folk knowledge, passed down through generations of mothers and wise women. They tear strips from Peter's wife's spare shift to bind the wound. Someone runs to fetch honey from the village beehives. Honey helps prevent the corruption that kills more injured people than the original wounds. Others gather herbs that are said to stop bleeding and promote healing. You and the other men stand awkwardly nearby, wanting to help, but knowing this is women's work. Your role is to decide whether Peter can be moved and how to get him back to the village. The steward Geoffrey rides over to assess the situation, his primary concern being whether this will significantly slow the harvest. Peter's injury represents a catastrophe for his young family. If the wound becomes infected, which is more likely than not with medieval medicine, he could die, leaving his pregnant wife a widow before she's even a mother. Even if he recovers, a damaged leg might prevent him from doing the heavy field work that's his only source of livelihood. The community will help as they can, but resources are limited. Peter's wife might have to return to her parents' household. Their tiny cottage might pass to another family. The careful balance of labor and resources that keeps the village functioning has been disrupted by one moment of exhaustion and misfortune. This is the reality of medieval life. You live always on the edge of disaster, where a single accident, illness, or crop failure can destroy everything you've worked to build. There are no insurance policies, no social safety nets, no hospitals with trained doctors. You have only your family, your community, and your faith to stand between you and catastrophe. The scythes seem more dangerous now, the uneven ground more treacherous, the relentless pace more exhausting. But the grain won't harvest itself, and winter won't wait for human concerns about safety and comfort. The work continues because it must continue. This is perhaps the most defining characteristic of medieval peasant life, the absolute necessity of perseverance, regardless of circumstances. You cannot take sick days or personal time or stress leave. You work or you die, and often you work until you die. As the sun begins its slow descent toward the western horizon, your body screams for relief. Every muscle aches, every joint protests, and your hands have long since gone numb from gripping your tool. Yet the end of the workday brings not rest, but merely a transition to different kinds of labor. The harvest continues until the light becomes too dim to safely wield sharp blades. This is determined not by clocks, which don't exist in your world, but by the practical ability to see what you're cutting. When Jeffrey can no longer clearly count the bundles being created, when accidents become more likely than productivity, only then does he call an end to the day's labor. Your shadow has grown long across the stubbled field, and the first evening stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky. You've been working for nearly 13 hours, with only brief breaks for food and water. Thomas staggers slightly as he tries to match your pace walking back to the village. His young body is exhausted beyond anything a modern child could imagine. There are no child labor laws in medieval England, no concept that children deserve protection from adult responsibility. By the time a peasant boy reaches 12, he's expected to contribute as much as his strength allows to the family's survival. Margaret and Anne have spent their day not in leisure, but in their own exhausting round of domestic duties. While you work the harvest, they maintain the household tasks that never end, tending the small vegetable garden behind your cottage, caring for the pig and chickens, preparing what meals they could with limited ingredients, mending clothes that must last for years, and a dozen other tasks essential to survival. Medieval life recognizes no clear distinction between work time and personal time. From dawn to dusk, everyone in the family labors at something necessary for survival. Rest is not a right, but a brief pause between urgent tasks. As you approach your cottage, you can see smoke rising from the hole in the thatched roof that serves as your chimney. Margaret has managed to keep the fire alive throughout the day, a small miracle that means warmth and cooked food for the evening. Letting the fire die would mean a cold night and the difficult task of rekindling it from flint and tinder. Your evening meal is simple, but represents the culmination of an entire day's labor by the whole family. There's a pot of pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables are available, thickened with barley or oats, and flavored with herbs from Margaret's small garden. If you're fortunate, there might be a bit of bacon or salt pork to add to the pot, though meat is a rare luxury. The bread for supper is dark and coarse, made from flour that includes not just wheat or barley, but whatever else could be ground to extend the supply. Peas, beans, sometimes even ground acorns in the hardest time. To modern tastes, it would seem barely edible, but to you it represents security, sustenance, and the fruit of honest labor. You eat by the light of the fire, and perhaps a single candle made from animal fat. Candles are precious, the materials to make them are expensive, and they burn quickly. Most evening activities happen in near darkness, with only the flickering firelight to illuminate your small world. The whetstone rasps against metal as you carefully restore the edge that will determine tomorrow's productivity. A dull blade makes the work twice as hard and twice as dangerous. Margaret sits nearby, spinning wool into thread by the firelight. Her spinning wheel, one of your family's most valuable possessions, clicks rhythmically as she works. The thread she creates will eventually become cloth, which will become clothes for the family. Nothing is purchased that can be made at home, because money is scarce and self-sufficiency is survival. In medieval England, a woman who cannot sew, cook, preserve food, tend animals, manage a household and bear children, is a woman who cannot contribute to a family's survival. These are not optional social graces, but essential life skills. Young Thomas sits cross-legged by the fire, weaving new handles for tools from strips of wood he's been preparing during the long winter months. Even in rest, his hands stay busy with tasks that will make tomorrow's work possible. Little William has already fallen asleep in his straw bed, exhausted by his day of gleaning and minor chores. At 6 years old, he's already learning that life is hard work, with brief moments of rest. Play, as modern children understand it, barely exists in medieval peasant life. Every activity has a purpose related to survival. As the fire burns lower, you reflect on the day's events. The harvest progresses well, despite Peter's accident. The weather has held fair, which is a blessing that could change at any moment. Your family is healthy, fed, and together. In medieval terms, this represents considerable success. But you also worry, as every peasant worries every day. Will the harvest yield enough to pay your obligations to the Lord and still feed your family through winter? Will the weather hold long enough to bring in all the grain? Will any of your children fall ill during the coming cold months? Will you yourself remain strong enough to work through another year? These concerns are not abstract fears, but immediate, practical calculations of survival. In your world, planning ahead means the difference between life and death, and the margin for error is almost non-existent. Margaret sits beside you on the simple wooden bench that serves as your only furniture, besides the sleeping pallet. Her hands, like yours, bear the marks of constant labor, cuts from kitchen knives, burns from the fire, calluses from spinning and weaving. At 28, she looks older than modern women at 40, aged by childbearing, hard work, and the constant stress of uncertainty. You take her rough hand in yours, a simple gesture of affection and solidarity. In a world where survival requires the labor of every family member, marriage is as much a practical partnership as a romantic union. You depend on each other absolutely. Her skills complement yours, her labor makes your labor possible, her knowledge fills the gaps in your own. She leans against your shoulder, and for a moment, the crushing weight of responsibility lifts slight. Tomorrow will bring more back-breaking labor, more uncertainty, more worry about survival. But tonight, in this brief hour before sleep, you have warmth, food, family, and each other. The fire burns down to glowing embers. Outside you can hear the night sounds of medieval England, the distant howl of wolves in the forbidden forest, the rustle of small animals in the thatch above your head, the occasional lowing of cattle in the village common. These sounds, which would terrify a modern person, are familiar and almost comforting to you. They represent the natural order of a world you understand. One by one, the family settles into their sleeping places. There are no separate bedrooms. The entire family sleeps in the main room of the cottage, sharing warmth and security. Privacy, as modern people understand it, is an unknown luxury. Medieval life is communal by necessity. You bank the fire carefully, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the night. Tomorrow you'll blow on these coals to rekindle the flame that will cook your breakfast and warm your cottage. Fire is life, and maintaining it is one of your most important daily responsibilities. As you settle onto your straw mattress and pull your woolen blanket around you, your body slowly begins to relax from the day's exertions. Every muscle aches, but this is the normal state of being for a medieval peasant. You've never known a day without physical pain, never imagined that life could be otherwise. Your last thoughts before sleep are of tomorrow's tasks, more harvesting, more back-breaking labor, more steps in the endless cycle of work that defines your existence. But also another day of survival, another day of family, another day of life in a world where simply continuing to exist is an achievement worthy of pride. In cottages throughout Ashwell, other peasant families are having similar evenings, the same simple meals, the same essential tasks, the same quiet moments of rest before another day of labor. This is the rhythm of medieval life, as regular and unchanging as the seasons themselves. 3 weeks have passed since Peter's accident, and the major harvest is nearly complete. The Lord's grain has been safely gathered and stored in his great barn, a massive structure that dwarfs any building in your village. Your own small portion, the grain from your allocated strips of land, sits in sacks in your cottage loft, carefully counted and recounted. But as October's chill begins to creep into the morning air, a new kind of anxiety settles over the village. Winter is coming, and with it, the hardest months of the medieval year. His wife gave birth to a daughter, a healthy child, which is itself a miracle in a time when infant mortality claims nearly half of all babies before their first birth. But a new mouth to feed, combined with Peter's reduced earning capacity, has left his family in a precarious position. As winter approaches, the village community has helped as they can, sharing small amounts of grain and offering extra work when possible. But everyone's resources are stretched thin, and charity, however well-intentioned, cannot change the harsh mathematics of survival. You've calculated your grain stores dozens of times, trying to balance the amount needed for daily bread against the seed grain that must be saved for spring planting. The numbers are always tight, always uncertain. If the winter is mild and short, you might have grain to spare by spring. If it's harsh and long-lasting until April or even May, your family could be facing starvation by February. There's no way to know, no weather forecasts, no emergency supplies to fall back on. You must guess correctly, or face the consequence. Margaret has been working frantically to preserve every scrap of food for the lean months ahead. Vegetables from the garden have been dried, pickled in precious vinegar, or stored in the root cellar dug beneath your cottage floor. Apples from the village's few fruit trees have been dried into hard, leathery chips that will provide vitamins during the months when fresh food disappears entirely. The pig, one of your family's most valuable assets, will be slaughtered in a few weeks, after it has been fattened on fallen acorns and kitchen scraps. This annual event provides the only substantial amount of meat your family will eat all year. Every part of the animal will be used, the meat salted and smoked for preservation, the blood made into sausages, the fat rendered for cooking and candles, the hide tanned for leather, even the bones saved for tools and need. The process of preserving food is an art passed down through generations of women, refined by centuries of experience with survival. A mistake in preservation means spoiled food, and spoiled food means hunger. Margaret knows exactly how much salt to use, how long to smoke meat, which herbs prevent corruption, and how to store everything to maximize its lifespan. Thomas has been gathering firewood whenever he's not needed in the fields, building a stack behind the cottage that will hopefully last through the cold months. Wood gathering is harder than it sounds. You're not allowed to cut living trees from the Lord's forest without permission, so you must search for fallen branches, and scraps of wood that no one else has claimed. Anne has been stuffing additional straw into the walls of the cottage, trying to block the gaps where winter wind will whistle through. She's also been gathering rushes from the village pond to make fresh floor covering for the cold months, when the family will spend more time huddled in. Even little William has winter tasks. He's been collecting feathers from the village geese and ducks, stuffing them into cloth bags that will serve as pillows and additional warmth during the coldest night. He's also been gathering nuts and berries from the forest edges, adding to the family's store of preserved foods. The approach of winter changes the rhythm of village life. The frantic urgency of harvest gives way to the methodical preparation for survival. Every family is engaged in the same activities: preserving food, gathering fuel, repairing clothing and tools, and making the 100 small preparations that might mean the difference between life and death during the harsh months ahead. But winter preparation isn't just about food and fuel, it's also about community. The families who help each other during the abundant months of harvest are the ones who survive the lean months of winter. Alliances formed in autumn determine who will have help when the snow falls and resources become scarce. Your family has always been respected in the village. You're known as a hard worker. Margaret is skilled at healing and midwifery, and your children are well behaved and contribute to the family's success. This reputation means that when you need help, people are more likely to provide it. When others need help, you're expected to give it. The social web of medieval village life is complex and vital. Everyone owes everyone else various forms of assistance, and these debts are carefully remembered and repaid. John the miller's wife helped deliver Anne when she was born, so you always bring him your grain to mill even though his fees are higher than others. Old William taught Thomas how to sharpen tools properly, so you always help with his harvest even though he works slowly. These relationships aren't based on friendship in the modern sense, but on mutual necessity. You help others because you need their help to survive. It's a practical calculation, but it creates a community bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. As November approaches, the first hard frost arrives, killing the last of the green plants and signaling the true beginning of winter's reign. The fields that just weeks ago were golden with grain now lie brown and stubbled, waiting for spring's return. The trees have lost their leaves, standing bare and stark against the grey sky. The change in seasons brings a change in mood. The relative optimism of harvest time gives way to the grim determination of winter survival. Conversations become more serious, focused on practical concerns about food stores, fuel supplies, and the health of family members. Laughter becomes rarer, smiles more precious. The sun rises later and sets earlier, and most tasks must be completed during the precious hours of natural light. Candles and oil lamps are too expensive to burn for routine work. The shorter days mean more time spent indoors, crowded into the small cottage with your family and animals. The warmth is welcome, but the close quarters test everyone's patience. Tempers flare more easily when people are confined together, when privacy is impossible, when the stress of winter survival weighs on everyone's mind. Margaret has begun the winter clothing repairs that will occupy much of her time during the cold months. Your woolen tunic, the only warm garment you own, has tears from the harvest work that must be carefully mended. The cloth is too valuable to waste, so even the smallest holes must be patched with scraps saved from previous years. Anne is learning to sew by helping with these repairs. Her stitches are uneven and sometimes crooked, but she's developing the skills she'll need to maintain her own family's clothing someday. In medieval life, there are no clothing stores, no ready-made garment. Everything must be made by hand from raw materials, using skills passed down through generations. The long evenings give him time to learn from you how to carve handles, repair broken implements, and maintain the tools that make survival possible. These skills are as important as any formal education, more important since they directly affect the family's ability to work and therefore to eat. The boy watches intently as you show him how to judge the grain of wood, how to shape a handle so it won't crack under stress, how to fit metal to wood so the joint will hold for years of hard use. Your hands guide his smaller ones, teaching through touch and demonstration the knowledge that kept your father alive, and his father before him. There's something meditative about working with wood, about creating something useful with your hands, about passing knowledge from one generation to the next. For a brief time, you're not just a beast of burden grinding through another day of labor, but a craftsman, a teacher, a link in the chain of human knowledge. But even these peaceful moments are shadowed by the reality of your situation. The wood Thomas is learning to work with represents weeks of careful gathering. The tools he's learning to maintain are irreplaceable if they break and cannot be repaired. The family's ability to work and therefore to survive is compromised. As the nights grow longer and colder, the family begins to gather around the fire earlier each evening. The fire is the center of your world during winter. It provides warmth, light, and the ability to cook food. Maintaining it becomes a constant preoccupation, and letting it die completely would be a disaster that could threaten the family's survival. The fuel requirements are enormous. A medieval cottage fire must burn continuously for 4 or 5 months, consuming vast quantities of wood. Despite Thomas's efforts to gather fuel, you worry constantly about whether you have enough to last through the winter. Running out of fuel in January would be a death sentence for the entire family. Margaret has begun rationing the evening meals more carefully. The portions are smaller now, designed to stretch the grain stores as far as possible while still providing enough nutrition to sustain hard work. Every meal is a careful calculation. Too little food and the family weakens. Too much and the stores run out before the children accept these smaller portions without complaint. They've never known abundance, never expected that food should be plentiful and varied. Hunger is a familiar companion, sometimes sharp and immediate, sometimes a dull ache that never quite goes away. Your own body has adapted to this cycle of scarcity and abundance. During harvest time, when food is relatively plentiful, you put on a little weight. During winter, you gradually lose that weight, your body consuming its own fat reserves to supplement the reduced food intake. By spring, you'll be gaunt and weak, but hopefully still alive. This annual cycle of feast and famine is built into the very structure of medieval agricultural life. The harvest provides abundance, but that abundance must be carefully managed to last through the months when nothing grows. It's a balancing act that requires incredible skill and more than a little luck. As you settle into your straw bed on this cold November night, you reflect on the year that's ending and the winter that's beginning. The harvest was good, not abundant, but adequate. Your family is healthy, your tools are in good repair, your cottage is as weatherproof as you can make it. But you also know that the hardest months lie ahead. December, January, February and March will test your family's endurance, your food stores, your fuel supplies, and your will to survive. Some families in the village will not see spring. Some children will not live to see their next birthday. Some elders will not survive another winter. These are not morbid thoughts, but practical realities. Medieval life requires a clear-eyed assessment of dangers and resources. Hope is important, but it must be tempered with realism. You hope for a mild winter, but you prepare for a harsh one. You hope your family stays healthy, but you know what herbs and treatments to use if illness strikes. The wind outside is picking up, whistling through the gaps in your cottage walls that Anne stuffed with straw earlier. The sound is familiar and somehow comforting. It's the sound of winter's approach, but also the sound of home, of family, of the small refuge you've built against the harsh world outside. The children are quiet, exhausted by their day of work and preparation. Even the animals seem to sense the changing season, settling more quietly into their corners of the cottage. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tasks, new worries. But tonight, you have warmth, shelter, family, and the precious gift of rest. In the grand scheme of medieval life, these simple blessings represent considerable success. You are alive, your family is alive, and you have a reasonable chance of surviving another winter. For a medieval peasant, this is as close to happiness as life allows. Not joy or pleasure or fulfillment, but the deep satisfaction of having done what was necessary to survive another day. Tomorrow you'll wake to new challenges, but tonight you can rest in the knowledge that you've met today's obligations and earned another brief respite from the endless demands of survival. January has arrived with a vengeance. The snow began falling 3 days ago and shows no sign of stopping. Already drifts reach halfway up your cottage walls, and the wind drives the frozen crystals through every gap in the walls that Anne tried so carefully to seal with straw. Your family huddles around the fire, which now burns day and night. The cottage is filled with smoke because the primitive chimney system struggles with the strong winds. That smoke is better than freezing. Your eyes water constantly, and everyone coughs from the poor air quality. But these are minor discomforts compared to the alternative of cold death. The food stores are holding up better than you dared hope. Margaret's careful rationing has kept the family fed, though the portions are smaller than during the abundant harvest months. Breakfast is a cup of thin porridge made from barley and oats, with perhaps a small piece of preserved meat if the day's work will be particularly demanding. But even with careful rationing, you can see the stores dwindling. The sacks of grain that seemed so substantial in October now look alarmingly small. Every meal represents a calculation. How much can you eat today while still having enough to last until spring? The mathematics of survival are relentless and unforgiving. Thomas has grown thinner over the winter months, his 12-year-old body struggling to maintain its growth on reduced rations. His face has become gaunt, his clothes hang loose on his frame, and his energy levels have dropped to notice. Yet he never complains, never asks for more food, never questions the necessity of hunger. This stoic acceptance of hardship is one of the defining characteristics of medieval peasant life. Children learn early that complaining doesn't create more food, that wishes don't change reality, that survival depends on enduring whatever circumstances life presents. It's a harsh lesson, but one that separates those who survive from those who don't. Anne has taken on more responsibility for maintaining the household fire. At 10 years old, she understands that keeping the flames alive is literally a matter of life and death. She feeds the fire with careful precision, adding just enough wood to maintain heat, without wasting the precious fuel supply. The wood stack that seemed so large in autumn has shrunk alarmingly. Despite Thomas's efforts to gather fuel, despite your own careful collection of every scrap of burnable material, the pile diminishes day by day. You've begun burning furniture, starting with the least essential pieces, but knowing that eventually you may have to burn the bed frames and benches that represent years of careful carpentry. Margaret has begun supplementing the family's diet with foods that would seem inedible to modern people. She makes soup from bones that have already been boiled multiple times, extracting every last bit of nutrition from animal remains. She grinds acorns and beech nuts into flour, adding them to the grain stores to make them stretch further. On the worst days, she's even resorted to making bark bread, peeling the inner bark from trees and grinding it into a coarse flour that can be mixed with the precious grain. It tastes terrible and provides little nutrition, but it fills empty stomachs and creates the illusion of having eaten a meal. The village has become increasingly isolated as the snow continues to fall. The roads are impassable, cutting off any possibility of trade or communication with the outside world. Each cottage becomes a tiny island of warmth and life in an ocean of cold and death. This isolation brings its own psychological challenge. The same family members who provided comfort and support during the busy harvest months now become sources of irritation and conflict. Living in such close quarters, sharing the same small space with people and animals, breathing the same smoky air, eating the same monotonous food, it all wears on the nerves. Arguments break out more frequently now. Thomas and Anne squabble over minor issues that would have been ignored during better times. Margaret snaps at you for small mistakes or inefficiencies. You find yourself losing patience with the children over trivial matters. The stress of survival, combined with the close quarters and reduced nutrition, affects everyone's mood and judgment. But these conflicts are quickly resolved because everyone understands the stakes. A family that falls apart during winter is a family that dies during winter. Whatever anger or frustration builds up during the day must be set aside for the sake of survival. Unity isn't just a virtue, it's a necessity. The animals sharing your cottage have become both blessing and burden. The pig, chickens, and goat provide warmth and will eventually provide food. But they also consume resources and create additional mess in the already crowded space. Their waste adds to the smell and unsanitary conditions, but their body heat helps warm the cottage. Caring for these animals during winter is a constant challenge. They need food when human food is scarce, water when everything is frozen, and shelter when space is limited. Yet they represent a crucial investment in the family's future. Eggs, milk, and eventually meat that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The social fabric of the village has changed during the winter month. Families that seemed secure in autumn now show signs of serious distress. Peter's family, already struggling because of his injury, has been forced to ask for help from neighbors. Old William, living alone since his wife died last spring, has moved in with his daughter's family to conserve resources and share warmth. These arrangements are made without sentiment or charity in the modern sense. They're practical decisions based on survival calculation. Families combine resources not out of kindness, but because it improves everyone's chances of living through the winter. It's cooperation born of necessity rather than affection. The death rate always increases during winter, and this year is no exception. 3 elders have died since the snow began, their weakened bodies unable to withstand the cold and reduced nutrition. Their deaths are mourned, but they're also seen as tragic inevitabilities, rather than unexpected shocks. Medieval people understand death in ways that modern people can. It's not a distant possibility, but a constant companion. Children die regularly, adults die young, elders die as soon as their bodies can no longer fight the endless battle against cold, hunger, and disease. Death is sad, but it's also natural and expected. The Church provides what comfort it can during these dark months. Father Benedict conducts brief services in the unheated church building, his breath visible in the frigid air, as he speaks of eternal life and divine providence. His sermons focus on endurance, on the virtue of suffering, on the promise that current hardships will be rewarded in the afterlife. These religious consolations are not empty words but vital psychological support. The promise of heaven provides hope when earthly life offers only hardship. The belief that suffering has meaning and purpose helps people endure conditions that would otherwise be unbearable. Your own faith has been tested by years of hardship, but it remains strong. Not because life has been easy, but because faith provides the only explanation for why life must be so difficult. Without the belief that current suffering serves a divine purpose, the daily struggle for survival would be meaningless. You pray regularly, not for comfort or abundance, which seem impossible, but for the strength to endure another day, another week, another winter. Your prayers are practical requests for specific help, that the food will last, that the fire won't die, that no one in the family will fall seriously ill. As February arrives, the food situation becomes increasingly desperate. The grain stores that seemed adequate in January are now dangerously low. Margaret has begun mixing sawdust with the flour to make it stretch further, though this provides no nutrition and may actually be harmful to eat. The hunting restrictions that normally prevent peasants from taking game in the Lord's forest are quietly ignored during the worst winter months. Desperate men set snares for rabbits and birds, risking severe punishment if caught, but facing certain starvation if they don't try. The choice between illegal hunting and death is no choice at all. Thomas has begun showing signs of serious malnutrition. His growth has stopped, his hair has lost its luster, and his energy levels have dropped dramatically. Yet he continues to work to help with household tasks, to contribute what he can to the family's survival efforts. His quiet courage in the face of suffering is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Anne has developed a persistent cough that worries Margaret greatly. In medieval times, winter coughs often develop into serious respiratory infections that can kill children. There are few effective treatments beyond keeping the patient warm and hoping their body can fight off the illness. The herbal medicines that provide the only healthcare available to peasant families are running low. Margaret gathered and dried herbs during the summer and autumn, but winter illnesses consume these precious remedies quickly. Willow bark for pain relief, elderberry for coughs, chamomile for stomach troubles. Each remedy used brings the family closer to having no medical resources at all. Even little William, now 7 years old, understands the gravity of the situation. He stopped asking for food between meals, stopped complaining about the cold, stopped engaging in the normal play activities of childhood. Like his siblings, he's learned that survival requires conserving energy and accepting hardship without complaint. The psychological toll of winter survival is as challenging as the physical hardships. The constant worry about food, fuel, and health creates a mental state of chronic stress that affects everyone's ability to think clearly and make good decisions. Small problems seem overwhelming. Minor setbacks feel like catastrophes. Sleep becomes elusive despite the long winter nights. Hunger gnaws at empty stomachs, cold seeps through inadequate clothing, and worry keeps minds active when bodies desperately need rest. The family lies awake, listening to the wind howl around the cottage, each person alone with their fears and concerns. Yet even in the darkest moments, there are small sources of comfort and hope. The fire still burns, providing warmth and light. The family is still together, still alive, still fighting for survival. Margaret's skill in managing resources has kept them fed longer than many families. Thomas and Anne continue to help with household tasks despite their weakened condition. These small victories matter enormously in the context of medieval survival. Each day lived is a triumph. Each meal shared is a blessing. Each night survived brings the family one step closer to spring. The margins may be razor thin, but they're still alive, still functioning as a family unit, still maintaining their humanity in the face of inhuman conditions. As February slowly gives way to March, you begin to allow yourself the faintest hope that winter might be ending. The days are gradually getting longer, the storms seem less frequent, and occasionally you catch a hint of warmer air mixed with the bitter cold. Spring is still weeks away, but it's no longer an impossible dream. The food stores are now critically low, perhaps 2 weeks of normal rations remaining, or a month if the family continues to accept increasing hunger. But March historically brings the first opportunities to supplement the diet with early greens, tree buds, and other wild foods that can help bridge the gap until the grain stores are replenished. The next few weeks will be the most dangerous of the entire winter. This is when families that have managed to survive the worst of the cold finally succumb to starvation. This is when the accumulated effects of months of inadequate nutrition finally overwhelm the body's ability to function. This is when hope and despair battle most fiercely in the human heart. But you've made it this far, and that accomplishment should not be underestimated. Your family is alive, your cottage is intact, your tools are ready for spring work. You've demonstrated the resilience, skill, and determination that define the medieval peasant experience. Whatever challenges the next few weeks bring, you'll face them with the same quiet courage that has carried you through the winter's worst trials. The wind howls with a fury that seems almost supernatural, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and creating drifts that completely bury the lower portions of cottages. For 3 days and nights, the storm rages with unrelenting intensity. Inside your cottage, the family huddles together in a space that grows smaller by the hour as the cold penetrates deeper into the living area. The fire, despite Anne's careful tending, struggles against the fierce drafts that find their way through every crack and crevice. The smoke, unable to escape through the chimney against the powerful winds, fills the cottage with a thick, choking haze that burns eyes and lungs. Margaret has wrapped the younger children together under every available piece of cloth and fur, creating a cocoon of shared body. Thomas, despite his weakened state, helps maintain the fire throughout the night, taking turns with Anne in a vigil that cannot be abandoned even for a moment. Sleep becomes impossible as the cold creeps steadily inward, and the family spends the dark hours talking quietly, sharing stories and memories to keep their minds occupied and their spirits alive. Snow has piled against the cottage door to a height that makes opening it impossible from the inside. You and Thomas must work together to dig through the packed snow, creating a tunnel that allows access to the outside world. The physical effort required for this task, normally simple work, leaves both of you exhausted and breathing heavily, a clear indication of how much the winter has weakened your bodies. The village beyond presents a scene of devastation. Several cottage roofs have collapsed under the weight of snow, forcing families to seek shelter with neighbors. The communal well is completely buried, requiring the entire able-bodied population to work together in creating access to water. Most seriously, the storm has claimed 2 more lives: elderly Agnes, who lived alone at the village edge, and infant Mary, whose family's cottage lost its roof during the worst of the winds. She had been surviving alone in her small cottage, too proud to ask for help and too independent to accept offers of assistance. When neighbors finally reach her dwelling, they find her body frozen in her bed, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned. Her food stores, such as they were, consisted of a few handfuls of grain and some dried vegetables that would not have lasted another week. Her death serves as a stark reminder of how quickly medieval life can shift from difficult to impossible. Agnes had been a skilled weaver, a valuable member of the community, who contributed her labor and knowledge to village life. But during winter, individual skills matter less than collective resources and mutual support. Her death is mourned, but it also reinforces the lesson that survival depends on community cooperation rather than individual stubbornness. By early March, the village economy has shifted into what can only be described as survival mode. Traditional concepts of wealth, property, and individual ownership begin to break down as families face starvation. Robert the miller, whose grain stores seemed abundant in autumn, now finds himself in the position of having to make impossible decisions about who receives the remaining supplies and who must go without. The social hierarchies that normally structure village life become both more rigid and more fluid during these critical weeks. Lord Edmund's steward arrives on horseback, accompanied by armed guards, to collect whatever taxes and rents can still be extracted from the desperate population. The contrast between his well-fed appearance and the gaunt faces of the villagers is stark and bitter, yet no one dares to voice their resentment openly. At the same time, traditional class distinctions blur as survival needs override social convention. The village priest finds himself chopping wood alongside peasant farmers, his holy orders providing no exemption from the practical requirements of staying warm. The blacksmith's wife, normally considered above manual farm labor, helps Margaret gather firewood and tends the cottage fire when Anne's cough makes her duties difficult to perform. The grain stores now amount to less than a week's worth of normal portions, forcing Margaret to make the meal portions so small that they provide barely enough nutrition to maintain basic body functions. The morning porridge has become little more than flavored water, with a few floating grain particles. The evening meal consists of thin soup made from bones that have been boiled so many times they crumble at the top. Thomas has begun experiencing episodes of dizziness and weakness that prevent him from performing even light work. His 12-year-old body, already stressed by months of inadequate nutrition, shows signs of serious malnutrition that worry you deep. His cheekbones have become prominent in his thinning face, his eyes appear too large for their sockets, and his movements have slowed to conserve energy. Anne's cough has worsened, developing into a wet, rattling sound that suggests fluid in her lungs. Medieval medicine offers few effective treatments for respiratory infections, and Margaret's dwindling supply of herbal remedies provides only temporary relief. The combination of poor nutrition, constant cold, and smoky air creates ideal conditions for serious illness to develop. Margaret's knowledge of survival techniques, accumulated over years of difficult winters, becomes increasingly vital as the crisis deepens. She demonstrates skills that represent generations of accumulated wisdom about how to extract nutrition from seemingly useless materials, and how to make the most of desperately limited resources. From the oak trees near the cottage, she harvests acorns that require careful processing to remove their natural bitterness. The acorns must be shelled, ground into meal, then leached with multiple changes of water to remove the tannins that make them inedible. This process takes several days and uses precious water, but the resulting flour can extend the grain stores significantly. She also begins harvesting inner bark from birch and poplar trees, stripping away the outer layers to reach the cambium layer that can provide some nutritional value. This bark must be dried, ground and mixed with grain to create a bread that tastes terrible but provides bulk and some calories. The process is labor-intensive, and the results are barely palatable, but in the context of starvation, any source of calories becomes precious. From the few remaining vegetables in storage, mostly root vegetables that have begun to sprout or soften, she creates broths that extract every possible bit of nutrition. Potato peels, carrot tops, onion skins and other scraps that would normally be fed to animals or thrown away become ingredients in soups that provide warmth and the illusion of substance if not actual nutrition. She even knows how to prepare leather for consumption in truly desperate circumstances. Old leather items, worn-out shoes, damaged harnesses, scraps from repairs, can be boiled repeatedly to create a gelatinous broth that provides some protein. The process is lengthy and the results are barely edible, but it represents another option in the arsenal of survival techniques. Thomas, Anne, and little William have adapted to circumstances that would traumatize modern children, accepting hardship and hunger with a stoicism that speaks to both their harsh upbringing and their innate resilience. Thomas has taken on adult responsibilities without complaint or resentment. He helps maintain the fire, assists with food preparation, and contributes to family discussions about resource management with a maturity that belies his 12 years. His acceptance of hunger and cold demonstrates the harsh reality that medieval children must grow up quickly or risk not growing up at all. Anne continues to care for her younger brother with touching dedication despite her own illness and weakness. She shares her meager food portions with William, tells him stories to distract from hunger, and maintains the household fire with careful attention to conservation. Her 10-year-old hands have become skilled at tasks that require precision and judgment, skills that will serve her throughout her life if she survives to adulthood. William, despite being only 7 years old, has learned to endure discomfort without the constant complaints that would be expected from a modern child. He understands, without being told explicitly, that crying and fussing will not improve the situation and may actually make things worse by disturbing the family's precarious and emotional balance. His quiet acceptance of circumstances represents the ultimate adaptation to medieval life's harsh reality. Despite the individual focus on family survival, the village community continues to function as a support network that can mean the difference between life and death for struggling families. Information about survival techniques, warnings about potential dangers, and practical assistance with essential tasks flow through informal channels that connect every household. Martha, the village's most experienced midwife and healer, makes regular rounds to check on families with young children or elderly members. Her knowledge of herbal medicine and practical healthcare provides the only medical support available to the community. She carries with her a small supply of precious remedies: willow bark for pain, elderberry for respiratory problems, and chamomile for digestive issues that she dispenses carefully to those in greatest need. The village blacksmith, despite his own family struggles, continues to maintain essential tools and equipment that the community needs for survival. Broken cooking pots, damaged fire tools, and worn farm implements receive repair when possible, or are salvaged for materials that can be used to create replacement items. His smithy, one of the few buildings with a forge that can generate significant heat, also serves as an informal gathering place where villagers share information and provide mutual support. Father Benedict expands his role beyond spiritual guidance to provide practical leadership during the crisis. He organizes work parties to clear snow from essential pathways, coordinates the sharing of resources between families with surpluses and those facing immediate starvation, and serves as a mediator when conflicts arise over resource allocation. His authority as a religious figure gives him the moral standing to make difficult decisions about who receives help and who must wait. As March progresses and the food situation becomes increasingly desperate, the psychological effects of prolonged hunger begin to affect every aspect of daily life. Hunger is not simply physical discomfort, but a consuming mental state that influences thinking, emotions, and behavior in profound ways. The constant gnawing sensation in empty stomachs creates a persistent distraction that makes concentration on other tasks difficult. Simple decisions that would normally be made quickly and easily become complex problems that require careful consideration. The mental energy required to resist the urge to eat precious food stores creates additional psychological stress that compounds the physical effects of malnutrition. Sleep patterns become disrupted as hunger interferes with the body's natural rhythms. Family members lie awake thinking about food, remembering meals from better times, or fantasizing about the abundance that spring might bring. Dreams often center on eating, creating a cruel contrast between sleeping fantasies and waking reality. Arguments that would have been minor disagreements in better times escalate into serious conflicts that threaten family unity. The stress of survival, combined with the physical effects of hunger, creates emotional volatility that requires constant management. Yet the same harsh conditions that create psychological stress also generate remarkable displays of human resilience and compassion. Family members who might normally compete for resources instead share what little they have. Parents continue to show love and care for their children, despite their own suffering. The community maintains its social bonds, even when individual survival might seem to require selfish behavior. By the middle of March, subtle changes in the environment begin to signal winter's approaching end. The days grow noticeably longer, providing additional hours of weak sunlight that offer both practical benefits and psychological relief. The sun's angle creates more direct heating during midday hours, allowing family members to venture outside for brief periods without immediate risk of frostbite. Snow begins to show signs of settling and compacting rather than continuing to accumulate. The fierce winds that characterize the worst winter storms become less frequent, replaced by calmer weather that makes outdoor activities marginally more feasible. Ice formations around the cottage begin to show signs of melting during the warmest part of sunny days, though they refreeze each night. These small changes create a psychological shift that is as important as any physical improvement in condition. The possibility of survival, which seemed increasingly remote during February's worst storms, begins to seem achievable again. Hope, carefully suppressed during the darkest weeks to avoid the pain of disappointment, tentatively begins to resurface. Margaret begins to plan for early spring foraging activities that could supplement the family's desperately low food stores. Her knowledge of wild plants includes dozens of species that become available during the earliest weeks of spring: young nettle shoots, dandelion greens, wild onions, and various tree buds that can provide vitamins and minerals missing from the winter diet. The prospect of fresh food, even in small quantities, provides enormous psychological relief. The monotonous diet of grain porridge and thin soup has created cravings for different flavors and textures that go beyond simple hunger. The promise of variety, of foods that taste different and provide different nutrients, offers hope that the family can survive until the growing season provides more abundant resources. This is traditionally the period when families that have survived the cold months finally succumb to starvation, as their food stores are completely exhausted, but spring growth has not yet provided alternatives. Medieval people call this period the hunger gap, the crucial weeks that determine whether a family will survive to see another harvest. Your family's grain stores are now completely gone, with the last handful of flour mixed with bark and sawdust to create a thin gruel that provides more psychological comfort than actual nutrition. The few remaining root vegetables in storage have begun to rot, though Margaret carefully cuts away the spoiled portions to salvage what nutrition remains in the healthy parts. The animals that have shared your cottage throughout the winter now represent the family's last resort. The decision to slaughter the pig, the animal that was intended to provide food for the entire next year, becomes unavoidable. This choice represents the ultimate sacrifice of future security for immediate survival, a decision that will have consequences far beyond the current crisis. The slaughter itself becomes a community event, as neighbors contribute their skills and labor in exchange for small portions of the meat. The blacksmith provides sharp knives, Martha the healer offers her knowledge of butchering techniques, and Father Benedict says prayers of gratitude and blessing over the animal that will save human lives. Every part of the pig is utilized with careful precision. The meat is divided into portions for immediate consumption and for smoking or salt curing to preserve as much as possible. The blood is mixed with grain scraps to create blood pudding. The organs are prepared immediately as they cannot be preserved. Even the bones are saved for soup making, and the hide will be processed for leather once weather permits. As April finally arrives, bringing with it the first definitive signs of spring, your family has achieved what seemed impossible just weeks earlier. You have survived the winter. The cost has been enormous. Weakened bodies, depleted resources, and the sacrifice of future security. But the essential goal has been accomplished. Life continues. The early April landscape still shows winter's grip, but the changes are unmistakable. Snow begins to melt in earnest during sunny days, creating the first running water the village has seen in months. The earliest spring plants, hardy weeds and wild herbs, begin to show green shoots through the remaining snow cover. Birds return to the area, their songs providing the first natural music heard since autumn. Margaret ventures outside to gather the first wild edibles of the season, her knowledge of plants ensuring that the family can supplement their diet safely with foods that would be overlooked by those lacking her expertise. Young nettle shoots, violet leaves, and dandelion greens provide essential vitamins and minerals that have been missing from the diet for months. The psychological transformation that accompanies spring's arrival is as dramatic as any physical change. The oppressive weight of potential death that has shadowed every decision throughout the winter begins to lift. Planning becomes possible again, as the future shifts from a series of daily survival challenges to longer-term considerations about planting, building, and preparing for the next cycle of season. Thomas and Anne begin to show signs of recovery as their diet improves, and the stress of immediate survival diminishes. Their energy levels increase, their spirits lift, and they begin to engage in normal childhood activities that were impossible during winter's worst month. The resilience of young bodies, given adequate nutrition and freedom from constant stress, demonstrates the remarkable human capacity for recovery. The knowledge of what can be endured, what resources can be stretched to their absolute limits, and what sacrifices can be made when necessary, becomes part of the family's accumulated wisdom. Margaret's skills in resource management and survival food preparation have been tested under the most extreme conditions and proven effective. This knowledge will be passed on to the children, ensuring that future generations will have the tools necessary to survive similar crises. The techniques for processing acorns, preparing bark bread, and extracting nutrition from seemingly inedible materials become part of the family's cultural inheritance. The children have learned lessons about endurance, cooperation, and the value of resources that will shape their approach to life throughout their adult years. They have experienced genuine hardship and discovered their own capacity for courage and resilience. These lessons cannot be taught through words alone, but must be learned through lived experience. The community bonds forged during the winter crisis will influence village relationships for years to come. Families who shared resources, provided mutual assistance, and supported each other through the darkest months have created connections that transcend normal social boundaries. The knowledge of who can be trusted during a crisis and who will contribute to community survival becomes valuable social capital. Your own faith has been strengthened rather than weakened by the experience of extreme hardship. The prayers for strength and endurance have been answered, not through miraculous intervention, but through the development of inner resources that allowed the family to persist when persistence seemed impossible. The belief that suffering has meaning and purpose has been validated by survival itself. As spring progresses and the immediate crisis passes, the memory of winter's harsh lessons will remain vivid and influential. The knowledge that survival is possible, even under the most difficult circumstances, provides confidence for facing future challenge. The understanding of what truly matters, family unity, community cooperation, and the basic necessities of life, puts all other concerns into proper perspective. The long winter's grip has finally loosened, but its lessons will endure forever. Geoffrey's appearance reminds everyone that survival through winter is not freedom from obligation. The steward's cold eyes assess each family's condition, calculating how much work can be expected from weakened bodies in the coming planting season. His ledger contains not names but numbers: how many days of labor each household owes, how much grain must be delivered as rent, which families might need to be replaced if they cannot fulfill their duty. Relief because his visit confirms that the outside world still exists, that trade and commerce continue beyond the village boundaries. Dread because his expectations remain unchanged despite the obvious suffering winter has inflicted. There will be no reduction in obligations, no mercy for families who have lost members, no acknowledgement that survival itself has been an achievement. You stand with the other village men, feeling the steward's calculating gaze measure your worth as a labourer. Your thinned frame and hollow cheeks tell the story of winter's toll, but Geoffrey sees only whether you can still pull a plough, still swing a scythe, still fulfill your role in the agricultural machine that sustains the manor system. The conversation between Geoffrey and the village elder reveals the broader economic reality of medieval life. Several families have indeed perished during the winter. Their cottages stand empty, their fields unworked. The steward makes notes about redistributing their land obligations to surviving families, increasing everyone's burden to compensate for the losses. Margaret listens to these arrangements with growing anxiety. Thomas is in no condition to take on additional field work, yet the family may have no choice. The feudal system recognizes no distinction between reasonable and unreasonable demands. Obligations must be met regardless of personal circumstance. Failure to fulfill duties could result in eviction from the cottage and loss of all rights to work the land. The steward also brings news from the wider world, though it's hardly encouraging. Other villages have suffered similar losses during the harsh winter. The roads remain impassable in most areas, delaying the movement of goods and people that normally marks spring's arrival. The wool merchants who usually visit in early spring may not arrive for weeks or even months, disrupting the village's small cash economy. This isolation has practical implications beyond commerce. Medical help from the nearest town remains unavailable. The travelling priest who normally visits monthly has not been seen since before Christmas. News of political developments, weather patterns in other regions, and market prices remains unknown. The village exists in complete isolation, dependent entirely on its own resources and knowledge. Anne has begun showing signs of what medieval people called spring fever, not the modern romantic notion, but a serious medical condition caused by months of inadequate nutrition. Her gums bleed, her joints ache, and her energy remains low despite the psychological boost of spring's arrival. These symptoms, which we now recognize as scurvy, were common among medieval populations who lacked fresh foods through the winter months. Margaret treats Anne's condition with whatever remedy she knows: pine needle tea for its cleansing properties, early spring herbs for their strengthening effects, and careful rationing of any foods that might provide missing nutrients. However, medieval medical knowledge provides little understanding of the specific nutritional deficiencies causing these symptoms. The treatment becomes another burden on the family's limited resources. Time spent gathering medicinal plants is time not spent seeking food. Energy devoted to caring for the sick reduces the workforce available for survival tasks. Yet Anne's condition must be addressed, both for her immediate health and for her ability to contribute to the family's spring work. The village's surviving animals present another complex challenge as spring approaches. The chickens that stopped laying during the worst of winter show no signs of resuming egg production. Their bodies remain too stressed and malnourished to support reproduction. The decision of whether to slaughter them for meat or continue feeding them in hopes of future eggs represents another of winter's impossible calculations. The pig has survived, but at considerable cost. It has consumed food that could have fed the family, yet it represents the largest potential source of meat and fat for the coming year. Slaughtering it now would provide immediate relief from hunger, but eliminate future security. Keeping it alive means continued competition for scarce resources, with no guarantee it will survive to breeding season. The goat continues to provide small amounts of milk, but even this has become irregular as her body struggles with poor nutrition. The milk that once supplemented meals now barely provides a daily cup for the youngest child. Yet this animal represents the family's most reliable renewable food source, making her care a top priority despite the cost. The cold, damp conditions of the cottage, combined with his weakened state, have created perfect conditions for respiratory illness. In an era without effective medical treatment, such conditions often prove fatal, particularly for those already weakened by malnutrition. The family watches Thomas's condition with growing fear. His cough produces bloody sputum, his breathing becomes labored with any exertion, and his appetite disappears entirely. These symptoms suggest serious lung infection or perhaps the beginning stages of consumption, tuberculosis, which medieval medicine cannot effectively treat. Margaret prepares what remedies she knows: steam treatments with herbs, poultices for his chest, teas made from willow bark for fever. These treatments provide comfort, but little real medical benefit. The family's survival increasingly depends on Thomas's physical labor, yet his condition suggests he may not be able to contribute to spring plant. The social dynamics within the family have shifted as winter has progressed. You, as the father and head of household, have seen your authority gradually erode as physical strength has diminished. Decision-making has become more collaborative, with Margaret's practical knowledge and Anne's energy playing larger roles in daily survival. This shift reflects broader changes in medieval society during crisis periods. Traditional hierarchies become less relevant when survival depends on practical skills rather than social position. Margaret's knowledge of plant medicine, Anne's ability to forage, and even the younger children's sharp eyes for finding food become more valuable than traditional male authority. Yet this democratization of family decisions creates its own tensions. Medieval society provides clear rules for patriarchal authority, but little guidance for collaborative family management. The adjustment requires constant negotiation and occasional conflict as traditional roles clash with survival necessities. The religious calendar continues to mark time, despite the family's desperate circumstances. The approach of Easter brings both hope and additional burden. The Church's expectation of special observances and potential donations conflicts with the family's complete focus on survival. Yet the religious community remains an important source of psychological support and social connection. Father Benedict's own weakened condition has affected his ability to provide spiritual leadership. His sermons have become shorter and less frequent. His voice lacks its former strength, and his physical presence reminds parishioners of their collective vulnerability. Yet his continued efforts to maintain religious observances provide crucial psychological stability. The Easter season traditionally marks rebirth and renewal, themes that resonate powerfully with families struggling through winter's end. The promise of resurrection offers hope that current suffering serves a divine purpose, that endurance will be rewarded, that death itself need not be permanent. These beliefs provide meaning that makes continued struggle psychologically possible. As March advances, the year becomes increasingly erratic. Warm days that melt snow and encourage foraging are followed by sudden freezes that kill emerging plants and trap the family indoors again. This unpredictability makes planning nearly impossible and repeatedly raises and dashes hopes for winter's end. The phenomenon known as sugar snow, late winter snowfall on warm ground, creates particular challenge. The snow melts rapidly, creating floods that wash away early spring plants and make travel impossible. Roads that seem to be clearing become muddy torrents that isolate the village even more completely. Yet each warm day brings visible progress. Snow reveals more patches of dark earth, ice on streams begins to break up with musical cracking sounds, and the angle of sunlight through cottage windows grows noticeably steeper. These small changes provide hope that maintains morale during the continued hardship. The village's water situation has become critical as winter's end approaches. The well that served the community through most of the winter has begun to show signs of contamination, a greenish tinge, an unpleasant smell that suggests organic matter has entered the water supply. Drinking this water risks disease, but alternatives remain limited. Melting snow provides some fresh water, but collecting and storing it requires constant effort. The family's few containers must be constantly managed, filled with snow to melt, emptied when clean, refilled when contaminated water has been used for washing or cooking. Water management becomes another complex task in the family's survival routine. The contaminated well also affects the broader village community. Families must travel farther to find clean water sources, consuming energy that could be used for food gathering. The risk of waterborne illness increases just as spring offers hope for improved conditions. Clean water becomes as precious as food in the survival equation. His fever returns each evening, leaving him delirious and calling out names of people long dead. Margaret spends precious hours caring for him when her time should be devoted to foraging and preparing for spring plants. The difficult decision looms. Should scarce resources continue to be spent on Thomas's care when his recovery seems unlikely? Medieval families faced such choices regularly, though they were rarely discussed openly. The allocation of food, warmth, and attention during survival crises required brutal calculations about who was most likely to survive and contribute to the family's future. Margaret refuses to abandon her son, but you can see the cost in her own declining health. She gives Thomas portions of her own meager meals, stays awake through the night, monitoring his condition, and exhausts herself gathering plants that might ease his suffering. Her devotion exemplifies medieval family loyalty, but it also threatens the entire household's survival. Anne has begun experiencing episodes of what medieval people called brain fever, periods of confusion and disorientation that we now recognize as symptoms of severe malnutrition, affecting cognitive function. She sometimes forgets where she placed gathered food, becomes lost walking familiar paths, and occasionally fails to recognize family members. These episodes terrify the family because they suggest that Anne's condition has progressed beyond simple hunger to actual brain damage. In an era without understanding of nutritional science, such symptoms appeared supernatural or evidence of divine punishment. The family's religious faith provides little comfort when faced with inexplicable mental deterioration. The practical implications are devastating. Anne's foraging skills have become crucial to the family's survival, but her increasing unreliability makes it dangerous to depend on her efforts. The family must now allocate precious energy to supervising her activities, while still benefiting from her knowledge of edible plants. Your own condition has deteriorated to the point where simple tasks become monumental challenges. Walking to the village center leaves you breathless and dizzy. Lifting even small objects requires rest periods. Your hands shake constantly, making precise work nearly impossible. Yet the spring planting season approaches, demanding physical labor that seems beyond your current capabilities. The psychological impact of physical weakness cannot be understated. Medieval masculine identity centered on physical capability and the ability to provide for family. Your inability to fulfill these traditional roles creates shame and depression that compound the physical challenges of survival. The loss of self-worth makes continued struggle even more difficult. Margaret tries to reassure you that your survival is what matters, not your productivity, but medieval society provides little support for such perspectives. Men who cannot work lose social status, family authority, and community respect. The fear of becoming a burden rather than a provider adds psychological suffering to physical hardship. The village elder's authority means little when he lacks the physical strength to enforce decisions. The blacksmith's skills are useless when no one has resources to pay for his services. This breakdown creates opportunities but also dangers. Families must make independent decisions about resource allocation, land use, and community cooperation without traditional guidance. Some families benefit from this freedom, while others suffer from the lack of coordinated planning and mutual support. The absence of social order also enables desperate behavior that would normally be prevented by community oversight. Reports circulate of families stealing from each other, abandoning sick relatives, and making agreements they cannot honor. Trust, which normally binds village communities together, erodes under the pressure of survival desperation. The cottage must be constantly monitored to prevent desperate neighbors from taking the family's remaining grain or discovering hidden food caches. This need for vigilance adds another burden to the family's already overwhelming challenges. Someone must always remain at the cottage while others forage or work. Sleep becomes fitful as every sound outside might signal an attempted theft. The social bonds that normally provide security have been replaced by suspicion and fear. The moral implications of this situation create additional psychological stress. Medieval Christian teaching emphasizes charity and mutual aid, yet survival seems to require selfishness and distrust. The conflict between religious values and practical necessities adds spiritual suffering to physical hardship. These small, bitter bulbs provide minimal nutrition, but offer hope that nature is beginning to provide again. More importantly, they represent a psychological victory that helps maintain morale during the darkest period. The discovery triggers a systematic search of every possible growing area around the cottage. Margaret and Anne spend entire days examining every patch of ground, every sheltered corner, every south-facing slope where early plants might emerge. This search consumes enormous energy, but occasionally yields precious finds. The family has learned to eat plants that would normally be considered inedible: tree bark, grass roots, and leaves that are bitter or tough, but not poison. Medieval knowledge of emergency foods, passed down through generations of periodic famine, now becomes essential for survival. Every plant must be evaluated for its potential nutritional value. The approaching Easter season brings additional pressure, as the Church expects special observances and contributions. Father Benedict's requests for donations to support Easter services seem impossible to fulfill, yet refusing could damage the family standing in the religious community that provides their only social support outside the household. Religious obligations compete with survival necessities in ways that create genuine moral dilemmas. Should the family's last handful of grain be used for bread for communion or porridge for breakfast? Should time be spent attending Easter services or foraging for food? These questions have no clear answers in medieval moral theology. The Church's teachings about sacrifice and suffering provide some comfort by giving meaning to current hardships, but they also create guilt about the family's desperate focus on materials. The tension between spiritual and physical needs becomes another source of psychological stress during an already overwhelming crisis. His fever spikes dangerously high, his breathing becomes labored even at rest, and he occasionally loses consciousness entirely. The family faces the terrible possibility that he may not survive to see spring's abundance, despite having endured months of winter hardship. Medieval death was a community event, but the village's weakened state means that traditional support systems cannot function normally. Neighbors who would normally assist with deathbed vigils and funeral preparations are too focused on their own survival to provide help. The family must face Thomas's potential death in isolation. Preparing for death while hoping for recovery requires emotional resources that the family barely possesses. Should precious food be wasted on someone who may be dying? Should energy be devoted to gathering medicine that probably won't work? These questions have no good answers, only choices between different types of suffering. The village's children have begun showing signs of permanent developmental damage from prolonged malnutrition. Their growth has stopped entirely, their mental development seems delayed, and their energy levels remain dangerously low. Even if spring brings adequate food, some of these effects may be irreversible. Parents watch their children's condition with particular anguish, because childhood malnutrition affects entire lifetimes. Children who survive winter may still face reduced life expectancy, decreased physical capability, and impaired cognitive function. The cost of survival may be measured, not just in immediate suffering, but in permanently diminished futures. Yet these children continue to display remarkable resilience and adaptability. They find aims in the midst of suffering, maintain hope when adults despair, and contribute whatever they can to family survival efforts. Their persistence provides inspiration that helps adults continue struggling when rational calculation suggests surrender. The final push through winter's end requires resources the family no longer possesses. Every task demands more energy than available. Every day presents challenges beyond current capabilities. Every decision risks consequences the family cannot afford. Yet surrender means certain death, so the struggle continues despite its apparent futility. Margaret has begun talking to herself during foraging expeditions, not from madness, but from the need to maintain morale through verbal encouragement. She recites recipes for food she hopes to cook again, describes the garden she plans to plant, and tells herself stories about better times ahead. These mental exercises provide the psychological strength necessary for continued physical effort. The family's survival now depends as much on willpower as on resources. The physical means of existence have been reduced to almost nothing, but the determination to endure until spring's abundance arrives keeps everyone struggling forward. Faith, hope, and sheer stubbornness become more important than food, warmth, or shelter. Buds on trees swell visibly each day, the sound of melting water becomes constant, and the angle of sunlight promises warmth to come. Most importantly, the days grow noticeably longer, providing more time for outdoor work and food gathering. Yet the family's condition continues to deteriorate, even as environmental conditions improve. The paradox of late winter, dying just as rescue approaches, claims many medieval lives. Bodies weakened by months of deprivation often cannot survive the final weeks before spring abundance arrives. Success requires enduring just a little longer when endurance seems impossible. The promise of spring has sustained the family through winter's worst moments, but now that promise must be fulfilled by actual survival until adequate food becomes available. The transition from winter survival to spring recovery will require its own strategies, its own challenges, and its own forms of endurance. The family's winter struggle may soon end, but their fight for life continues into the uncertain promise of spring's arrival.